Hi, this is Mrs. Basin, and today we're going to talk about collision theory. So the first thing we're going to look at is something called the collision model. So when you have a chemical reaction, in order for that reaction to take place, there have to be bonds broken and new bonds formed. So when you have all of these molecules in a reaction vessel, the molecules can only react if they collide with each other with the correct orientation and with enough energy to cause those bond breakages and formations. So if those three things don't happen, then you're not going to have a reaction. So one of the things we use to describe this is something called an effective collision. So if you look at the two pictures at the bottom, this first picture you can see the reactants here, but then you can see that the products are the same as what they started out with. So even though those two molecules might have come in contact with one another, they didn't meet all three of these requirements, so this would be called an ineffective collision. The bottom one, however, if we look at the reactants and then compare them to what's on the other side, we can see that new products were formed. So this bottom one we would call an effective collision, and all three of those conditions would have been met. The next thing we can look at when we're talking about reactions is something called molecularity. So the number of molecules involved in a single-step reaction is called its molecularity. A single-step reaction means that the reaction takes place in one single step. So later on we're going to talk more about multi-step reactions. But when we're talking about molecularity, we use molecularity to classify these single steps. So the first type is a unimolecular reaction. So in a unimolecular reaction, you have one substance as your reactant decomposing into your product. A bimolecular has two species reacting, and those two things have to collide in order to form your product. And they can be two different substances, or they can be two of the same. So all it has to do with is how many things are interacting as reactants in order to form products. The third one is something called a termolecular reaction. These are rare to have happen in a single step just because it's not going to be as common for three different species to all collide with each other with the right amount of energy in the right orientation to make that reaction take place. So these you don't see very often. And for termolecular, it could also be 2A plus B, or it could be A plus 2B. All it has to be is three total things reacting in order to form the product. The next thing we're going to look at is activation energy. So when you have a reaction, in order for that reaction to take place, you have to get over what's called the activation energy barrier. So you can look at this little picture up here. This kind of shows it as an energy hill. So in order for him to get this boulder up and down the other side of the hill, he has to overcome the hill, which represents our energy barrier or our activation energy. Once he gets it to the top of the hill, then that reaction is going to take place and that boulder is going to roll down the hill and you end up with products on the other side. So this is the minimum amount of energy required for the reaction to take place. If it doesn't hit the top of that energy barrier, then the reaction doesn't happen. So if he can only get this to here, it's just going to roll right back down and you're not going to see it roll down the other side and produce the products. We're going to watch this video here at the bottom just for a couple seconds. What this video shows is what happens when methane and oxygen react. This is the methane reaction, the methane bubble reaction that we did in class. So what you'll see in the beginning of the video is you'll see the oxygen molecules and the methane molecules just kind of bouncing around next to one another. So if you remember what we did in class, when we filled the bubbles with the methane, those methane molecules were in contact with the oxygen molecules, but nothing happened until I supplied the energy in order for it to overcome that energy barrier and then for those reactions to take place. So kind of listen here as he explains it.
If oxygen and methane molecules are mixed together in the same container, they collide. But there is no reaction until a spark or flame is added. Why? To react, the molecules must collide with sufficient energy to break the oxygen-oxygen bonds and carbon-hydrogen bonds so new bonds can form. The additional energy needed to break existing bonds and start the reaction is called activation energy. An energy diagram can help show these energy changes. Initially, the oxygen and methane molecules collide but do not have sufficient energy to react. A flame can supply the activation energy needed to start the reaction. At this point, bonds break and new bonds form in an exothermic reaction that releases energy. The energy released supplies the activation energy for other molecules to react, and the mixture explodes.
Okay, so that kind of takes you through the process of them getting enough energy. Once they have enough energy, then you can see the carbon dioxide and the water form as your products. So one of the things we can talk about when we talk about a reaction is what's called the enthalpy or the heat of reaction. What this tells us is the overall change in energy for a chemical reaction. So it's the amount of energy released or absorbed when you have a chemical reaction. There's two ways you can classify chemical reactions. One of them is exothermic. An exothermic reaction is going to release energy. So think of exo as energy exits the system. When we calculate the enthalpy, this is notated with a delta H. Sometimes you'll also see this as given as the energy of reaction and a delta E. For now, those two things can kind of be used interchangeably until we talk in a little more specifics about them when we get to AP Chem. So the delta H is the overall change. If something is exothermic, that delta H is going to have a negative sign, showing that energy is being released from the system or given off from the system. So if you look at this diagram down here, this is going to show us the energy of our reactants and the energy of our products. If our products are lower than our reactants, then that tells us it's an exothermic reaction or energy has been released. The other thing you can see on here is this is our activation energy, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. For an endothermic reaction, this absorbs energy. And you can think of this as energy is entering the system. This has a positive delta H, and again, that's because it's taking in energy. If you look at the graph for this one, here's the energy of the reactants, here's the energy of the products. So for this one, the products have more energy than the reactants. That means the energy was absorbed, and that tells us that that was an endothermic reaction. So let's look in a little more detail at these diagrams. These are called reaction coordinate diagrams. They can also be called potential energy diagrams. And what it shows us is it shows us where our reactants are, where our products are, what the energy associated with those are. It gives us the energy of activation. So we could calculate what the energy of activation is. We could calculate the overall change in energy. So here this is notated as a delta E. We could also call this a delta H for now. It shows us the transition state. The transition state is at the top of the energy hill. That's where the reactants are starting to transition to products. The activated complex is the complex that is present at the transition state as the reactants kind of transform back into the products. And then like we said, we already talked about the activation energy barrier. That's our difference between the reactants and the top of the energy barrier. So let's look at how this would be presented as an example problem here. So here's one, and notice this one actually has values on the y-axis, so that helps us be able to calculate some things here. So the first thing would say, what is delta H for the reactants? So here's our reactants. So this is where their energy is starting. So this tells us that our energy of our reactants is 150 kilojoules. This doesn't say kilojoules. We're going to assume this is kilojoules. That's how these energies are usually measured. The delta H of our products is going to be down here. So we're going to follow this over, and this shows us that the energy of our products is 50 kilojoules. The delta H of our reaction, just like before, if you have delta H of the reaction, that's going to be the heat of the products minus the heat of the reactants. So the heat of our products was 50 kilojoules. The heat of our reactants is 150 kilojoules. So our overall heat of reaction is negative 100 kilojoules. And that goes along with what we said before, because this is an exothermic reaction. So we can tell by a couple different ways. One, you'll know it's exothermic because it has a negative value for the heat of reaction. The other one, if you look at your graph, your products have a lower energy than your reactants, so that means the energy had to be released. And that can help you classify it as endo or exo. The last thing we can look at is the energy of activation here. So to figure out what the energy of activation is, we're going to take the difference between the reactants and the top of the energy barrier. So we're going to look at this area right here to figure out what that energy of activation is. So from 150 to 200, the difference there is 50 kilojoules. This number is always going to be positive because you have to put energy in to get it up to that point in order for the reaction to occur. So energy of activation again for this one would be 50.